Why doesn't my mom love me?" The whisper was so quiet, Gabriel Turner almost missed it over the rhythmic slosh of his mop. He stopped, the worn wooden handle resting in his palms. The little girl on the bench outside the principal's office wasn't looking at him, but her question hung in the empty, sterile hallway like a ghost. Diana Carrington, 9 years old. He'd known her face for 3 of them. First as the bright, bubbly kid whose father, a man with a kind smile and an easy laugh, would swing her into the air before school. Then, after the announcement of Mr. Carrington's sudden illness, as the quieter girl holding her father's hand a little tighter. And for the last year since the funeral, as this, a silent little shadow, shrinking in on herself. The whole school knew. Teachers spoke in hushed, sympathetic tones in the break room. The vibrant Carrington family had been fractured, and this child was living in the wreckage. Through the heavy oak door, the voice of Diana's mother, Helena Carrington, was a sharp, furious staccato. It was a voice accustomed to command, to slicing through arguments and leaving no room for dissent. "Unacceptable," the voice clipped. "Her performance is a reflection of this institution, and I assure you, my daughter will not be the face of your failure." Gabriel's heart ached. He looked at Diana, her small hands clutching a book she wasn't reading, her shoulders slumped. He saw the ghost of another little girl, one with his eyes and his late wife's smile. He pushed the memory down, the ever-present lump in his throat. He knew this kind of pain. He lived in its shadow. He knelt, the worn fabric of his work pants pressing against the cold linoleum. He kept his voice as soft as her whisper. "When a person's heart gets a big hole in it," he began, watching her carefully, "they can forget how to hold on to the people they love most. Their hands get clumsy, and they might even push them away." Diana's head tilted, her large, tear-filled eyes finally looking at him. For the first time in a long time, someone wasn't telling her to try harder or be better. They were just explaining the rain. He continued, his voice barely audible. "It's not because they don't love them. It's because they're terrified the hole will swallow them too." The principal's door flew open, and Helena Carrington stood there, a figure of immaculate, expensive tailoring and barely contained rage. Her sharp eyes, the color of storm clouds, took in the scene. Her daughter, her silent, failing daughter, talking to the janitor. Her face hardened, a mask of cold fury snapping into place. "Diana, we're leaving." Her voice was like ice. Diana flinched and rose immediately, her small book clutched to her chest like a shield. She didn't look at Gabriel again, just fell into step behind her mother, a tiny ship caught in the wake of a destroyer. Helena stopped and turned to Gabriel, who was slowly getting to his feet. Her gaze swept over his gray overalls, the scuffed work boots, the name Gabe stitched on his breast pocket. It was a look that dismissed his entire existence in a single, cold glance. "My daughter's well-being is handled by professionals," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Your job is to handle the floors. Make sure you don't confuse the two again." She didn't wait for a reply. She turned, her heels clicking an angry rhythm on the polished tile, and swept down the hall with Diana trailing silently behind her. Gabriel watched them go, his hand tightening on the mop handle. He hadn't been a teacher in 5 years, but the instinct to protect a child from a storm was still there, buried but not gone. He saw the way Helena grabbed Diana's arm, a little too tightly, and the way the girl's shoulders curled inward even further. He stood there for a long time after they were gone, the only sound the distant hum of the school's ventilation system. The smell of antiseptic cleaner filled the air. He had come to this job for the quiet, for the anonymity, for a life where he didn't have to pretend to be whole. He had believed his heart was too broken to be of any use to anyone, especially a child. He was here to be invisible. But Diana Carrington had seen him, and in her whispered question, he had heard the echo of his own suffocating grief. He picked up his mop and pail, the water now cold and gray. He worked his way down the hall, erasing the day's scuffs and footprints, but he couldn't erase the look in the little girl's eyes. He knew he should listen to Helena Carrington's warning. He should just be the janitor. He should keep his head down, stay in the shadows, and let the professionals handle it. But as he cleaned the floor where a mother's anger and a daughter's pain had collided, he made a silent promise. He wouldn't try to fix the hole in Helena Carrington's heart, but he'd be damned if he'd let it swallow her daughter too. He didn't know how, but he knew he couldn't just walk away. The invisible man had to do something. The next few days passed in a haze of ammonia and echoing silence. Gabriel went about his duties with a practiced efficiency, his mind miles away from the floors he polished. He kept his eyes open, watching from the periphery. He saw Diana in the lunch line, moving like a ghost through the chaos of laughing, shouting children. He saw her at recess, sitting on a bench under the great oak tree at the edge of the playground, her nose in a book, creating a fortress of solitude around herself. She never played with the other kids. She just watched. He knew Helena's warning had been absolute. One more misstep and he'd be out of a job, and more importantly, out of this small, quiet orbit around the girl who needed help. He couldn't talk to her again, not directly. But Gabriel had been a teacher long enough to know there were other languages besides words. On Wednesday morning, while clearing leaves from a clogged drain pipe near the oak tree, he saw it. A perfect abandoned bird's nest, blown from a high branch during the night storm. It was a delicate, intricate cup woven from twigs, grass, and bits of string. A tiny, miraculous piece of architecture. A home. He picked it up carefully, its fragility a weight in his rough hands. An idea, quiet and simple, began to form. That afternoon, he waited until recess. From the window of a second-floor hallway, he watched as Diana made her way to her customary bench. As soon as she was settled, he slipped out a side door and walked along the edge of the playground, his movements casual, just a janitor on his rounds. He approached the bench from behind, his footsteps soft on the grass. Diana didn't look up from her book. He gently placed the small nest on the far end of the bench, then retreated without a sound. From a distance, sweeping a path that didn't need sweeping, he watched. For 10 minutes, she didn't notice it. Then, as she shifted to turn a page, her eyes fell upon the nest. She froze, her head tilted with a cautious curiosity. She looked around, her gaze scanning the playground, but no one was paying her any attention. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out a small finger and gently touched the rim. She didn't smile, but a different look crossed her face. A quiet wonder. High above the city, in a glass-walled office that felt as cold and silent as deep space, Helena Carrington stared at a set of quarterly projections. The numbers were good, better than good. They were dominant, but they brought her no satisfaction. The acquisition of Omnicore is lagging, Helena. She didn't look up. She knew that voice. Julian Ramsey. Ambitious, slick, and circling her position like a shark. He stood in her doorway, a tablet in his hand, a look of feigned concern on his face. The timeline is aggressive, Julian, not lagging, she said, her voice flat. Your team is simply not meeting the benchmarks. My team feels there's a lack of clarity coming from the top, he countered, stepping into the room. A certain distraction. The board is getting nervous. They need to see you're focused, especially now. Helena finally lifted her eyes from the screen, her gaze so sharp it could have cut glass. Are you speaking for the board, Julian, or are you just trying on the chair for size? A flicker of anger crossed his face before being replaced by a placid smile. Just looking out for the company, and for you, of course. We all know how difficult this past year has been. It was a veiled threat, wrapped in the language of sympathy. He was using her grief as a weapon. The old Helena, the one before the diagnosis and the hushed hospital rooms, would have eviscerated him, The new Helena felt a wave of exhaustion so profound it almost buckled her, but she didn't let it show. "My focus is right where it needs to be," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous low. "Make sure yours is too. Meet the benchmarks. Now get out of my office." He held her gaze for a moment, then gave a slight, deferential nod and backed away, the predator retreating for now. Helena stared at the door long after he'd gone. She spun her chair to face the panoramic window overlooking the city, a city her husband had loved. Her hand went to the silver frame on her desk, a photo of him laughing with a 7-year-old Diana on his shoulders. A dull, familiar ache pulsed in her chest. Julian was right about one thing. She was distracted. Her focus, once a laser, was now fractured, split between running a billion-dollar company and managing a silent, grieving child who felt more like a failed project than her own daughter. She hated that thought. She hated herself for it. But it was true. Back at Northwood, the bell rang, signaling the end of recess. Children swarmed back toward the school building in a noisy, vibrant wave. All except Diana. She remained on the bench until the playground was nearly empty. Gabriel watched from the doorway as she stood up. For a moment, he thought she would leave the nest behind, but then, with a delicacy that seemed almost reverent, she picked up the small, woven cup. She held it in 2 hands, protecting it as she walked back toward the school. As she passed him, she kept her eyes fixed on the ground, pretending he wasn't there. But he saw it. The slightest of nods. A secret acknowledgement. Gabriel felt a flicker of warmth in the cold, hollow place in his chest. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't a cure. But it was something. A single, fragile thread of connection, cast into the silence. The conversation had begun. The bird's nest sat on Diana's nightstand, a fragile monument to a secret. For the rest of the week, Gabriel felt the change. When he passed Diana in the hall, she would risk a quick, fleeting glance in his direction before looking away. It was a tiny crack in the wall of her silence, but it was enough. He knew he had to keep the conversation going. The memory came to him on Saturday while he was sorting through a box of his daughter's old things, a painful, yearly ritual he could never quite bring himself to abandon. He found a worn copy of The Little Prince, its pages soft with use, and suddenly, he remembered. A sunny afternoon, 2 years ago. He'd been tending the flower beds near the playground when he saw them. Diana and her father, sitting on that same bench under the oak. Her father was reading aloud from a thick book, his voice animated, making her giggle. Gabriel had recognized the cover, The Wind in the Willows. The next day, Gabriel spent his afternoon in the city's oldest second-hand bookstore, a labyrinth of dusty shelves and the smell of aging paper. It took him 2 hours, but he finally found it. A beautiful 1960s edition, its cover a deep green, with rich, color plate illustrations of Ratty and Mole. Tucked inside the front cover, the previous owner had pressed a perfect, fiery red maple leaf. Gabriel left it there, a small, silent bookmark. On Monday, the book appeared on the bench. Gabriel watched from his usual distant post as Diana approached. She saw the book immediately. She stopped, her body tensing. She looked around, her eyes searching. This was different from the nest. This was something known, something personal. He saw her walk to the bench, her movements slow, almost fearful. She didn't pick it up at first. She just stood and stared at the cover. Then, her small hand reached out and traced the gold lettering of the title. He saw her shoulders begin to shake. She snatched the book, clutched it to her chest as if it were a life raft, and ran back toward the school building, disappearing inside. Gabriel's heart twisted. He had either made a terrible mistake or done exactly the right thing. That evening, Helena was working late at her dining room table, her laptop casting a cold blue light across a stack of legal documents. Diana was supposed to be doing her homework, but she was sitting on the floor, the strange, old book open in her lap. Helena had noticed it the moment Diana came home from school, clutched in her arms like a treasure. "Where did you get that?" Helena asked, her eyes not leaving the screen. Diana didn't answer. She never did. "Diana, I asked you a question. That's not a library book." The girl just shook her head, her fingers tracing one of the colorful illustrations. A wave of pure frustration washed over Helena. It felt like trying to communicate with a locked room. Every question was met with silence. Every attempt to help met with this passive resistance. "Fine," she snapped. "Fail your tests. Live in your own little world. But don't expect me to applaud you for it." The words were cruel, and she knew it the moment they left her mouth. She saw her daughter flinch, pulling the book tighter against her small body. The guilt was immediate and acidic, but she shoved it down. Guilt was a useless emotion. Results were what mattered. The next morning, as she was dropping Diana off, she saw it. On the pavement near the main entrance, drawn in bright blue chalk, was a small, simple drawing of a rowboat with 2 animal figures in it. It was charming. It was also undeniably a scene from The Wind in the Willows. Her blood ran cold. It wasn't a coincidence. The book, the drawing, it was a message. And she knew exactly who was sending it. She found Gabriel in the West Wing, buffing the floors. She didn't bother with pleasantries. She walked right up to him, her voice a low, furious hiss. "You! I told you to stay away from my daughter." Gabriel switched off the buffer, the machine winding down with a soft whir. He turned to face her, his expression calm, but his eyes were guarded. "Good morning, Mrs. Carrington." "Don't you good morning me," she seethed. "The book." "The chalk drawings." "What is your game? What do you want from her?" He didn't flinch. He just held her gaze, and for the first time, she saw something flicker behind his quiet exterior. It wasn't fear. It was a deep, soul-crushing sadness. "I don't want anything from her," he said, his voice even and steady, which only infuriated her more. "Then why are you doing this? It's inappropriate. It's creepy. You're the janitor. You have no right." "Your daughter is drowning in silence, Mrs. Carrington." He cut in, his voice still quiet, but now laced with an authority that stunned her. "I was just trying to throw her a rope." He took a half-step closer, and his eyes met hers with a raw intensity she couldn't look away from. "I used to be a teacher," he said, the words landing with the weight of a confession. "I know what a grieving child looks like." Helena froze, the angry retort dying on her lips. The sentence hung in the air between them, completely rearranging the world. The janitor, the man she had dismissed, threatened, and looked down upon. He was a teacher. The revelation was so unexpected, so entirely out of place, that for the first time in a very long time, the formidable Helena Carrington was left utterly, completely speechless. Helena stared at him. The words echoed in the empty corridor, completely short-circuiting the pathways of her anger. A teacher. The quiet janitor who smelled faintly of pine cleaner and sawdust had the steady, knowing eyes of an educator, of someone who understood children. It didn't compute. Her entire argument, built on the assumption of his lowly station and inappropriate meddling, crumbled into dust. She opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time, she had no rebuttal, no cutting remark. There was nothing to say. He had presented a fact that was so entirely outside her frame of reference that it had disarmed her completely. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked away, her retreat far less triumphant than her arrival. The clicking of her heels sounded less like a declaration of power and more like a frantic escape. Gabriel watched her go, the tension slowly draining from his shoulders, leaving him feeling hollowed out. He hadn't wanted to say that. The word teacher felt like it belonged to another man, a ghost from a life he no longer lived. It was a key to a door he never intended to unlock again. He had used it as a shield for Diana, but it had left him feeling exposed and raw. He picked up the buffer, the familiar weight of the machine a small comfort. He didn't know if he had just saved his job or sealed his fate. Back in the silent sanctuary of her high-rise office, Helena couldn't focus. The phrase "I used to be a teacher" played on a loop in her head. It was an anomaly, a piece of data that didn't fit the profile, and Helena Carrington did not tolerate anomalies. She leaned back in her leather chair and made a call. It was to a man who ran a private security and investigation firm that her company kept on a very expensive retainer. "I need a background report," she said, her voice clipped and impersonal. "Discreet, very discreet. The name is Gabriel Turner. He's an employee at Northwood Preparatory Academy. Of course, Ms. Carrington, any specific area of focus?" "Employment history," she said. "Education, everything." The report arrived in her encrypted inbox less than 3 hours later. She opened the file, her heart beating with a strange mix of dread and anticipation. The first few pages were standard. Gabriel Turner, age 38. No criminal record. Flawless employment history at Northwood for the past 4 years. Then she got to the previous section. Employment, 2008 to 2020. Cedar Creek Elementary, Westfall County. Position, 4th grade teacher. It was true. She scrolled further, her eyes scanning the file. Accolades, glowing performance reviews. Mr. Turner possesses a rare gift for connecting with his students. An unparalleled ability to foster a love of learning. He'd been awarded Westfall County's Teacher of the Year in 2018. There was a photo of him, younger, smiling, standing on a stage and holding a plaque. He looked happy. Whole. Then she reached the final entry in the file. An attached news clipping from a local paper dated May 12, 2020. The headline was stark. "Local teacher's family killed in a highway collision." Helena's breath caught in her throat. She clicked the link. A grainy photo of a mangled car. The article was short, brutal in its efficiency. A drunk driver had crossed the median. The victims were identified as Elizabeth Turner, age 32, and Lily Turner, age 7, wife and daughter of local teacher Gabriel Turner. The file, the office, the entire city outside her window seemed to fall away. Lily. His daughter was 7 years old, the same age as Diana when her father had gotten sick. It all crashed down on Helena with the force of a physical blow. His quiet, pervasive sadness. His words in the hallway. A big hole in the heart. He wasn't speaking in metaphors. He was speaking from experience. He saw Diana's grief because he was living in his own. His quiet gifts weren't an intrusion. They were acts of empathy from a man who knew exactly what that little girl had lost. She thought of how she had looked at him. The condescension in her voice. The disdain in her eyes. "Your job is to handle the floors." The memory made her skin crawl with a shame so intense it was nauseating. Later that afternoon, a call came from Diana's teacher. The woman sounded surprised, almost joyful. "Miss Carrington, I just wanted to share something wonderful. We had a group art project today, and for the first time all year, Diana participated. She didn't speak, of course, but she used chalk to draw the most beautiful mural on the paper for her group. She was collaborating." It was a major breakthrough. Helena hung up the phone, her hand trembling slightly. Chalk. The connection was undeniable. While she had been pushing, prodding, and punishing, Gabriel Turner had been quietly, gently, building a bridge. That night, Helena sat alone in her office long after the rest of the building had gone dark. The city lights twinkled below, a sea of indifferent stars. On her computer screen, she had pulled up the news clipping again. Next to it, she had the Teacher of the Year article open. She toggled between the two images, the smiling, vibrant man on the stage, and the small, blurry photo of a 7-year-old girl named Lily, a girl who would be 12 now. For the first time since her husband's death, Helena Carrington felt the ice around her heart not just crack, but ache. She looked at the photo of her own husband and Diana on her desk, and for a moment, she didn't see a memory to be conquered. She saw a reflection of a pain so profound, she had refused to truly face it. And she realized the janitor she had threatened to fire was, in almost every way that mattered, stronger than she was. The next morning, Helena Carrington did something she hadn't done in months. She made Diana breakfast. Not the sterile bowl of pre-portioned organic granola her housekeeper usually set out, but scrambled eggs, slightly burnt at the edges. She worked with a clumsy, unfamiliar rhythm. Diana watched from the table, her expression unreadable. The silence between them was different this morning. It was no longer just an absence of words, but a space heavy with things Helena didn't know how to say. "I'll drive you to school today," Helena announced, her voice a little too bright. Diana simply nodded. She walked her daughter to the front entrance, a sea of other parents offering brief, respectful nods to the well-known CEO. But Helena's eyes were scanning the grounds, searching. After Diana disappeared inside, Helena paused, took a deep breath as if preparing for a hostile takeover, and walked back into the school. She found him in the small, neglected greenhouse at the back of the property, a place most students and staff had forgotten existed. He was gently repotting a struggling orchid. He looked up as her shadow fell over him, his body immediately tensing, his hands stilling in the soil. He was expecting a fight. Helena stopped a few feet away, her arms crossed, a shield against her own vulnerability. "I looked you up," she said. The words were blunt, factual. An admission, not an apology. Gabriel straightened up slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. He didn't say anything, just waited, his eyes holding hers with a quiet, unnerving patience. The silence stretched. She had prepared a dozen speeches in boardrooms, dismantled powerful opponents with a few well-chosen words. But here, in a dusty greenhouse that smelled of damp earth, she was at a loss. "My assessment of your character," she began, the words stiff and formal, "was inaccurate. I misjudged the situation." For a woman who had never willingly admitted a mistake, it was the closest she could get to, "I'm sorry." Gabriel gave a slow, deliberate nod. "You saw a janitor, Mrs. Carrington." It's an easy mistake to make. There was no accusation in his voice, but the simple truth of it landed like a stone. She had judged the cover, not just of a book, but of a man's entire life. She took an involuntary step closer. "The teacher called yesterday," she said, her voice dropping, losing its corporate edge. "About Diana, the art project, the chalk." She looked at the fragile orchid in his hands. "Whatever you're doing, it's working, and what I'm doing isn't." The admission hung in the humid air, raw and real. "I don't know how to reach her," she confessed, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "I read parenting books like their quarterly reports. I hire the best tutors, the best therapists, and all it does is push her further away. I'm failing her." She finally looked at him, her carefully constructed mask of control completely gone, replaced by a desperate plea. "I need your help." Miles away, Julian Ramsey sat in his own silent, minimalist office, a smug smile playing on his lips. On his screen was the preliminary report from his investigator. A few grainy photos. The first was of Helena Carrington, CIO of a multi-billion-dollar firm, standing in a school garden in the middle of a weekday morning. The second was a close-up of the man she was talking to, the janitor. Julian chuckled. This was better than he could have hoped for. The board was already wary of her emotional state. This was a gift, a powerful woman, neglecting her duties to have clandestine meetings with a menial laborer. It was the perfect narrative. He picked up his phone and dialed the chairman of the board. "John, it's Julian," he said, his voice laced with manufactured concern. "I'm afraid we have a situation with Helena we need to discuss." Back in the greenhouse, Gabriel stared at Helena. The most powerful woman he had ever met was asking him for help, her eyes stripped of all their armor. He felt the old, familiar panic rising in his chest. He had run from this, He had buried his skills, his instincts, his entire past because it was tied to a pain so immense he feared it would break him again. Helping Diana from the shadows was one thing. Stepping into the light, into their lives, was another. It meant facing the ghost of the teacher he used to be. It meant opening his own scarred heart. He looked past Helena, through the grimy glass of the greenhouse, and saw the playground. He pictured Diana on her bench. Then, unbidden, came the image of another little girl with dark, curly hair, laughing as he pushed her on a swing. Lily. The risk was enormous. Getting involved could cost him his job, his peace, what little was left of his heart. But looking at the desperate mother in front of him, he thought of the silent little girl. He thought of the rope. He took a slow breath, the scent of orchid soil filling his lungs. "What?" he asked, his voice low and heavy with the weight of the decision. "Did you have in mind?" The question hung between them, heavy and uncertain. Helena, a woman who commanded rooms and dictated strategy, looked utterly lost. "I don't know," she admitted, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. "That's the problem. I've exhausted every strategy, every specialist. I just know that for the first time in a year, my daughter connected with something." With you, Gabriel looked away from her intense gaze, his eyes falling on the rows of seedling trays. He was a janitor. He cleaned up messes. He wasn't equipped for this. But the ghost of the teacher in him knew that the most complex problems often required the simplest first step. "Then we have to start there," he said quietly. "Not with tutors or therapy schedules, just with her. I need to see you together, not as a CEO and her project, but just as a mother and a daughter." He hesitated, the plan forming as he spoke. "This Saturday. Go to the park, the one with the duck pond. Don't try to get her to talk. Don't ask her about school. Just be there." "I'll meet you." Helena blinked. "The park? What will that accomplish?" "I don't know," Gabriel answered honestly, "but I can't understand a language I've never heard." I need to listen to her silence. The air at the park on Saturday was crisp and bright, but the atmosphere between the three of them was thick with awkwardness. Helena was dressed in stylishly casual clothes that still looked like a uniform. She was trying so hard it was painful to watch. "Look, Diana, a swing set. Do you want to swing? I can push you. We can see how high you can go," she said, her voice strained with forced enthusiasm. Diana shook her head, shrinking closer to the bench. "Okay, the slide then? It's very tall. That looks like a challenge." Gabriel watched from a few feet away, leaning against a tree. He saw what Helena didn't. Diana wasn't looking at the playground at all. Her gaze was fixed on the pond, where a flotilla of ducks was gliding across the water. Helena's shoulders slumped in defeat. She sat on the bench, pulling out her phone, the reflexive retreat of a woman uncomfortable with unstructured time. Gabriel walked over to a small vendor selling bags of bird feed. He bought one, then approached the bench. He didn't say a word to Diana. He just sat down on the other side of her, opened the bag, and tossed a handful of cracked corn toward the water's edge. The ducks immediately changed course, paddling furiously toward them. He held the open bag out, a silent invitation. Diana watched him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she reached in, her small hand taking a handful of feed. She tossed it, a little shyly at first, then with more confidence as the ducks quacked their approval. For the next 10 minutes they sat in a comfortable shared silence, feeding the ducks. Helena put her phone away, watching them. A painful, clarifying thought rose in her mind. Gabriel hadn't tried to manage Diana's happiness. He had simply noticed it and then shared it with her. It was a language of quiet observation she had completely forgotten how to speak. Later, as they walked along the path circling the pond, Helena found herself walking beside Gabriel while Diana skipped a few feet ahead. "How did you know to do that?" she asked, her voice low. "You were looking at the playground," he said simply. She was looking at the pond. He paused, then added, "My daughter, Lily." She was terrified of swings. but she would spend hours watching ants build a hill. You can't force a child to be interested. You just have to find out where their world is and go there. It was the first time he had said his daughter's name to her. The sound of it, spoken aloud, seemed to change the air between them. Lily, Helena repeated softly. It's a beautiful name. He gave a small, sad smile. She loved flowers, especially the ones that grew in the cracks in the sidewalk, the stubborn ones. In that moment, sharing a story of his lost child, he gifted her a piece of his trust. He was letting her see the man behind the grief. And Helena felt a profound, aching connection that went far beyond their shared tragedy. As they circled back toward the entrance, Diana, who was walking between them, did something unexpected. Her small hand slipped into Gabriel's. A moment later, her other hand, hesitantly, reached out and took her mother's. The three of them walked the last few yards in silence, connected by touch. Helena looked down at their joined hands, her manicured fingers, Gabriel's calloused ones, and Diana's small hand linking them together. A fragile, unlikely bridge. For the first time in a year, she felt a flicker, not of control, but of genuine, terrifying hope. She didn't know that across the street, a man in a parked car was lowering a camera with a long focus lens. He scrolled through the images he'd just taken. The powerful CEO, the janitor, and the little girl, holding hands like a family. He smiled, picked up his phone, and sent the photos to Julian Ramsey. The photos landed on the polished mahogany table of a private club with a soft, damning thud. Julian Ramsey watched the faces of the two board members across from him, Conrad Sterling and Marcus Vance. Older men, pillars of the financial community. Men who valued stability and perception above all else. This was Saturday, Julian said, his voice a low, concerned murmur, while the Omnicore deal was hitting a critical snag. Our CEO was at a public park with her daughter, and the janitor from her daughter's school. Conrad Sterling, a man with a face like a clenched fist, picked up a photo of the three of them holding hands. Who is this man? Gabriel Turner, former elementary school teacher, left the profession under a cloud 5 years ago after a family tragedy. Now he cleans floors for a living, Julian said, carefully curating the narrative. Look, I have sympathy for Helena, we all do, but her grief is clearly affecting her judgment. She's becoming erratic, forming inappropriate attachments. This isn't the behavior of a leader. It's a liability. Marcus Vance, shrewder and more cautious, looked from the photos to Julian. What are you suggesting, Julian? I'm suggesting we need to protect the company, Julian said smoothly. It might be time to consider a vote of no confidence. For her own good, of course. Helena walked out of her office at 5:30 p.m. on Tuesday. Her executive assistant, a young woman named Clara, nearly dropped her tablet. Miss Carrington, are you leaving? Clara stammered. You have the quarterly review proofs. Send them to my home tablet, Helena said, gathering her coat. I'll look at them after dinner. Clara stared, speechless. In 3 years, she had never known Helena to leave before 9 p.m. if there was still work to be done. The change was real, but it was fragile. That night, feeling a surge of hope from their weekend at the park, Helena made a critical miscalculation. She found Diana in her room, looking at the book Gabriel had given her. That was your father's favorite, Helena said softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. He used to read it to me when we were in college. Diana tensed, her fingers tightening on the book. Helena, mistaking her silence for an invitation, pressed on. He would have been so proud of you, Diana. He would want you to be strong. He wouldn't want you to be like this. He would want you to talk to me. It was the wrong thing to say. She was using his memory as a tool, a lever to pry open the silence. Diana's face crumpled. She looked at her mother with an expression of such profound betrayal that it made Helena recoil. Diana slammed the book shut, shoved it under her pillow, and turned to face the wall, her small back rigid. The door Helena thought was opening had just been slammed, bolted, and barricaded. An hour later, Helena went to check on her. The room was empty. The window was open, a cool night breeze rustling the curtains. Panic, cold and absolute, seized Helena's heart. She searched the house, her calls of "Diana" growing louder, more frantic with each empty room. She ran outside, circling the manicured lawn, her voice cracking. "Diana!" The controlled, formidable CEO was gone, replaced by a terrified mother on the verge of collapse. Her hands shaking, she fumbled for her phone and dialed the only person in the world she could think of. Gabriel answered on the second ring. "She's gone." Helena sobbed into the phone, the words torn from her. "Diana's gone." "I said the wrong thing, and she's gone." Gabriel's voice was an island of calm in her hurricane of panic. "Okay, Helena, breathe. Just breathe. Did you check the yard?" "Yes, everywhere." "I don't know where she would go." "Think, Helena. Where does she feel safe? Where is it quiet?" He pressed gently. He thought of the book, The Wind in the Willows. Then he thought of the other book he'd left her, the one on constellations. He remembered a conversation with the school's maintenance chief about the old roof access. "The school," he said with sudden certainty. "Meet me at the school." I think I know he was there in 15 minutes. His old pickup truck rumbling into the empty parking lot just as Helena's sleek sedan screeched to a halt. He didn't wait for her. He took a set of keys from his pocket and headed for a side entrance. He found Diana on the small, flat roof of the old library wing. It was a place no one ever went, a quiet, forgotten perch overlooking the city lights. She was huddled in a corner, her arms wrapped around her knees, her face turned up to the star-dusted sky. Gabriel didn't call out to her. He walked over slowly and sat down a few feet away, following her gaze. "That one there," he said softly, pointing. "That's Cassiopeia. It looks like a big W. Lily used to say it stood for wonderful." He sat with her in the cold, windy silence for 10 minutes before Helena, her face pale and tear-streaked, finally emerged onto the rooftop. She stopped dead when she saw them. Her daughter, safe, sitting beside the janitor, bathed in the soft glow of the city, looking at the stars. The relief was so powerful it buckled her knees. She leaned against the door frame, all the fight, all the anger, all the rigid control draining out of her, leaving only a vast, aching emptiness. Gabriel looked over and gave her a small, reassuring nod. Diana turned her head, her eyes meeting her mother's across the rooftop. There was no anger in her gaze, just a quiet, weary question. Helena stood there trembling, the mother and the CEO, her past and her future, all colliding under the silent, watching stars. She knew this was it, the breaking point. She had to find the right words, and she had absolutely no idea what they were. Helena's world narrowed to the few yards of gravelly rooftop separating her from her daughter. Every instinct she had, to command, to control, to fix, screamed at her to rush forward, to grab Diana, to end this terrifying ordeal. But she didn't. She saw the fragile piece Gabriel had created, and for the first time, she was wise enough not to shatter it. She walked forward slowly, her expensive shoes unsteady on the loose gravel. She didn't go to Diana. She went to the low parapet wall a few feet away from them and sat down, pulling her knees to her chest, mirroring her daughter's posture. She looked at the sky, at the vast, indifferent spread of stars. "When your father got sick," Helena began, her voice rough and unfamiliar, stripped of all its usual polish, "I declared war. On the doctors, the disease, the universe. I made a plan. I researched every trial. I set benchmarks for his recovery." She gave a short, broken laugh. "I thought I could manage his cancer like a hostile takeover." She finally turned to look at her daughter. "And I lost. And when I lost him, I think I declared war on everything else, including myself, including you." Tears she hadn't shed in a year began to trace hot paths down her cheeks. I miss him too, Diana, she whispered, the words a physical agony to speak. So much that sometimes I forget how to breathe. And when I can't breathe, I get angry. At the world, at him for leaving, at you for reminding me of him. She finally said the words, the ones that had been lodged in her throat for a year. It's not your fault. None of this is your fault. It's mine. I'm so sorry, Diana. I'm so sorry. The silence that followed was absolute. Gabriel remained perfectly still, a silent guardian. Then, Diana moved. She unfolded herself and crawled across the gravel, stopping just before she reached her mother. She looked at Helena's tear-streaked face, her own eyes shimmering. Then she leaned forward and rested her head on her mother's knee. A small, simple gesture of forgiveness that broke through the last of Helena's defenses. She wrapped her arms around her daughter, burying her face in Diana's hair, and sobbed. Gabriel stood up quietly. I'll go make sure the door didn't lock behind us, he said, giving them a privacy they desperately needed. Later, in the silent, moonlit hallway of the school, the crisis had passed. Diana was dozing in the passenger seat of Helena's car outside. Thank you, Helena said, her voice still raw. Gabriel, there are no words. You found the words that mattered, he replied, leaning against the lockers. She looked at him, at the quiet strength in his face, the deep-seated sadness in his eyes that she now understood. How do you do it? She asked. How do you live with it? The hole. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at a framed display of children's art on the wall. For a long time I didn't, he admitted. I just existed. But then I realized I was letting the last day I had with them erase all the beautiful days that came before. I couldn't fix what happened, but I could choose how I carried them. Lily wouldn't want her memory to be a cage for me. She'd want it to be a reason to be kind. He looked at Helena. You don't get over it. You just make more room in your heart. You learn to carry the sadness alongside the love. Your husband wouldn't want you to stop loving Helena, especially Diana. His words settled over her, a truth so profound it felt like a physical weight. He wasn't just a janitor. He wasn't just a teacher. He was a survivor. The next afternoon, a sleek, black courier envelope was delivered to Helena's office. Inside was a single sheet of paper with the company's letterhead. It was a formal notice, invoking a rarely used clause in the corporate bylaws. An emergency meeting of the board of directors had been called for Friday morning. The agenda item was singular, a review of the CEO's leadership and continued fitness to serve. It was signed by Julian Ramsey and co-signed by Conrad Sterling and Marcus Vance. The old Helena would have felt a surge of adrenaline, a lust for battle. She would have called her lawyers, her loyalists, and prepared to destroy them. But as she stood there, holding the declaration of war in her hand, she felt something else, a quiet, unshakable calm. Her gaze fell on a new drawing taped to the side of her monitor, put there that morning. It was a simple chalk drawing Diana had made for her. A woman, a girl, and a man, standing on a rooftop with a big W of stars shining above them. Her fight for the company had always been about power, about legacy, about winning. But now, it was about something else entirely. It was about protecting the fragile, hopeful new world she was just beginning to build. She picked up her phone and dialed Gabriel. They're coming for me, she said, her voice even. The board. They're trying to force me out. What are you going to do? He asked, his voice steady. She looked at Diana's drawing, at the three small figures holding hands under the stars. It's okay, she said, a small, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time. For the first time in a very long time. I know exactly what I need to say. The boardroom was a theater of silent, corporate warfare. 24 solemn faces sat around a vast, gleaming table of dark mahogany. the city skyline a cold, indifferent backdrop behind them. Julian Ramsey stood at the head of the table, his presentation projected on the screen behind him, charts showing fractional dips in productivity, timelines for the Omnicore deal shaded in cautionary yellow. He spoke with the polished, somber tone of a man delivering a difficult but necessary eulogy. Helena sat to his right, perfectly still. She wasn't wearing her usual stark, powerful suit. Instead, she had chosen a simple, elegant dress in a deep blue. Her demeanor wasn't defensive or aggressive. It was one of profound, unnerving calm. She let Julian talk, let him build his cage of data and innuendo. And while we all have the deepest sympathy for Helena's personal struggles, Julian said, his voice dripping with false sincerity, we have a fiduciary duty to this company, and her recent behavior has forced us to question her focus, her judgment. He clicked a button. The charts vanished, replaced by a photograph. It was the one from the park. Helena, Gabriel, and Diana, holding hands. It was followed by another. Helena and Gabriel in the school garden. This is Gabriel Turner, Julian announced, his tone condescending, the janitor at her daughter's school. While a multi-million-dollar acquisition hangs in the balance, our CEO has been spending her time, both on and off the clock, in the company of maintenance staff. This is not leadership. It is a catastrophic lapse in judgment. I am therefore calling for a vote of no confidence. He continued, but Helena was no longer listening. She was looking at the photo on the screen. She saw the three of them, a fragile, hopeful trio. Julian saw liability. She saw her salvation. When he finally finished, a tense silence filled the room. All eyes turned to her. She let the silence hang for a moment longer. Then she rose to her feet. Mr. Ramsey is correct about one thing, she began, her voice quiet, but carrying to every corner of the room. I have been distracted. A murmur went through the board. Julian's lips curved into a triumphant smirk. For the past year, Helena continued, her eyes sweeping across the faces at the table, I have been operating under the illusion that grief was an inconvenience to be managed, an inefficiency to be optimized. I tried to run this company and my own life with the same cold, brutal force of will that I always have. And in doing so, I was failing, miserably, not just as a CEO, but as a human being, as a mother. She turned her gaze to the photo on the screen. The man in that photograph is Gabriel Turner. And yes, he is a janitor. He is also a former Teacher of the Year. And he is a man who, after suffering a loss that would have destroyed most people, showed more integrity, more wisdom, and more quiet strength than I have witnessed in this boardroom in a very long time. She looked directly at Julian. Mr. Ramsey sees a janitor. I see a man who taught me that you cannot compartmentalize your humanity. A company is not just numbers on a spreadsheet. It is people. And a family is not a project to be managed. It is a heart that needs to be held. Her voice grew stronger, imbued with a power that had nothing to do with her title. You see these photos as a sign of weakness. I now know they are a sign of my recovery. You believe a leader must be an untouchable fortress. I have learned that a true leader is one who has the courage to be vulnerable, to be compassionate, to be, first and foremost, human. She finally turned her full attention on her rival. Mr. Ramsey sees loss as a weakness to be exploited for his own ambition. He sees kindness as a liability. He would have you believe that a heart is a dangerous thing to have in a CEO. I am telling you, it is the only thing that qualifies you for the job. So, yes, hold your vote, but know that you are not voting on my competence. You are voting on what kind of company you want to be. She sat down. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the quiet, dignified click of her pen as she placed it on the table. The board members weren't looking at the photos anymore. They were looking at Julian Ramsey, and for the first time, they were seeing him for exactly what he was. Helena didn't stay to count the votes. She knew she had won. She walked out of the boardroom, through her office, and didn't stop until she was in the parking garage. She drove straight to the school. It was the annual Founders' Day celebration, an outdoor event with games and food stalls. Families were everywhere. She found Gabriel and Diana near a small stage where a student choir was singing. Gabriel saw her first and gave her a questioning look. She responded with a small, definitive nod. A slow smile spread across his face. She walked over to Diana, kneeling down so they were eye to eye, the noise and chaos of the celebration fading into a dull hum. "Hi, sweetie," she said, her voice soft. Diana looked at her mother. She saw the strength in her eyes, but it was a different kind of strength now. It was warm. It was safe. She reached out and gently touched her mother's cheek. Then, in a voice that was clear and steady and full of a year's worth of unshed love, she spoke. "I love you, Mom." The words were the sweetest sound Helena had ever heard. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were not tears of grief or shame. They were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. She pulled her daughter into her arms, holding her tight. Gabriel stepped forward, placing a hand on both of their shoulders, his presence a warm, steady anchor. The professional storm was over. The personal one had finally passed. And in the middle of the crowded, sunlit schoolyard, a new family, forged in the fires of loss and redemption, was finally, truly whole. 1 year later, the morning sun streamed into a kitchen that was no longer a sterile, silent space, but a place filled with the smell of pancakes and the sound of quiet laughter. Helena, wearing an old, comfortable sweater instead of a power suit, expertly flipped a pancake, a dusting of flour on her cheek. Diana sat at the table, chattering away about a science project involving volcanoes, her voice bright and full of life. The front door opened and Gabriel walked in, but he wasn't wearing his gray janitor overalls. He was dressed in a crisp collared shirt and slacks, a worn leather satchel slung over his shoulder. He leaned down to kiss Diana's head, then walked over to Helena and kissed her, stealing a piece of bacon from the plate she was holding. "Morning, Mr. Turner," Helena said with a smile. "Ready to mold the young minds of the 4th grade?" "Always," he said, his eyes crinkling with a happiness she now knew so well. "It's good to be back." After the board meeting, Julian Ramsey had quietly resigned. Helena, with her newfound clarity, had restructured her executive team, promoting people based on integrity as much as ambition. She still ran her company with formidable skill, but she now led with her whole heart, and her employees had never been more loyal. She worked just as hard, but she no longer worked to escape. She worked to build. And she was always home for dinner. At Helena's urging, Gabriel had met with the headmaster of Northwood. He'd been hesitant at first, the ghost of his old life still a heavy weight. But with Helena and Diana by his side, he found the courage to step back into the light. When a 4th grade teaching position opened up mid-year, the school had practically begged him to take it. He was, by all accounts, the best teacher they had ever seen. That Saturday, they went back to the park with the duck pond. It had become their place. As Diana ran ahead to the swings, a place she was no longer afraid of, Gabriel and Helena sat on the bench where he had first left the bird's nest. He took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. "A year ago," he said, his voice quiet, "I was just trying to stay invisible. My world was very small, very gray. I was just waiting for it to be over." "I know the feeling," Helena whispered. "My world was a fortress. I thought if I built the walls high enough, nothing could hurt me again." "And now?" he asked. She looked at Diana, her daughter's laughter carrying on the breeze, a sound she once thought she'd never hear again. She turned back to him, her eyes shining. "Now, it feels like home." Gabriel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple box. He opened it. Inside was not a large, flashy diamond, but a simple, elegant band. I'm not a man of acquisitions or benchmarks, Helena, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I don't have a strategic plan. All I know is that my heart had a hole in it, and you and Diana didn't just fill it. You made it bigger. You taught it how to grow again. He took a breath. Helena Carrington, would you and Diana do me the honor of officially becoming my family? Tears streamed down her face as she nodded. Yes, she whispered. 1,000 times, yes. Their wedding was a small affair, held in the late afternoon sun in the school's greenhouse, the place where she had first asked for his help. Diana stood between them, holding both of their hands, her smile the brightest thing in the room. There was no board of directors, no corporate titans, just a few close friends and the quiet, steady promise of a shared future. They weren't a perfect family. They were a mosaic, made of pieces that had been shattered and then lovingly, carefully put back together. A CEO who had learned the value of a quiet moment, a teacher who had rediscovered his purpose, and a little girl who had found her voice. They were a family built not on the absence of scars, but on the courage to show them. They had learned that a heart with a hole in it isn't broken. It just has more room for love to get in. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. Every story has a character or a moment that pulls you in. I'd be honored to hear which part resonated most deeply with you, or maybe a time you felt something similar. And please, say hello and let us know what part of the world you're in. It makes this big world feel a little smaller and a little warmer, knowing we're all sharing this moment. I believe that sharing and listening to stories is one of the most powerful things we can do. It's a reminder that no one is truly alone. If these are the kinds of stories that feed your soul, think about hitting subscribe. It's not just a button. It's you saying you want to keep this conversation going. Your presence here makes all of this worthwhile. Seriously. Until next time, walk gently and carry a good story with you.